There is a specific moment you can watch for in any room. Someone asks a question that isn't really a question. It's a challenge dressed up as curiosity. What made you think that was okay? Are you sure about this? And you can watch in real time who reaches for a defense and who doesn't reach at all. The ones who reach, they start talking fast. They stack up reasons. They cite context, intention, extenuating circumstances. They perform their own innocence in front of an audience that half the time never asked for a trial. And then there's the other kind of person. The question lands and something strange happens. Nothing. No scramble. No stacking of justifications. Maybe a pause. Maybe a simple answer, 3 sentences long, delivered like a fact rather than a plea. And the room, without anyone announcing it, adjusts around them. This is not confidence in the way you've been taught to think about confidence. It isn't loud. It isn't a speech. It is the visible outer edge of something happening much deeper down. A private relationship with one's own decisions that most people never build, because nobody ever told them it was something to build. Here is the uncomfortable question underneath the title of this. Why do you explain yourself? Not should you stop. Why do you start? What is actually happening in you in the half second before the justification comes pouring out? Because if you can see that mechanism clearly, you will never need a technique to stop it. The compulsion will simply lose its grip, the way a rope loses its grip once you understand it was never tied to anything. Let's find it somewhere in your life. Probably early, probably long before you could have consented to it. You learn that your worth was provisional, not fixed, provisional. Renewable pending explanation. A parent's approval that arrived only after the right reasons were given. A teacher's grade that depended not just on the answer but on showing your work, as if the answer alone was never enough to be believed. A room where love or safety or belonging had to be argued for case by case, like a defendant standing before a jury that never left the building. And so a habit formed quietly and visibly, the way all the most powerful habits do, not through one dramatic event, but through 10,000 small repetitions, each one reinforcing the last. The habit was this: an action is not complete until it is explained. A decision is not valid until it is justified. A self is not safe until it is accounted for, and sat you down and taught you this. That's what makes it dangerous. Beliefs we're taught on purpose, we can question on purpose. But beliefs absorbed through repetition, through 1,000 tiny transactions where explanation bought safety, those settle into the floor of the mind and become the ground you stand on without ever noticing you're standing on anything at all. One of the oldest and most quietly devastating principles of personal power identifies exactly this pattern, though it rarely gets described in these terms. It is the discipline of thought, what some call autosuggestion, the recognition that the mind is not a passive recorder of the world but an active factory, manufacturing belief out of whatever raw material you feed it, over and over, until the belief hardens into something indistinguishable from truth. And here is the mechanism precisely. Every time you explain yourself to someone who has not earned the right to an explanation, you are not just responding to them. You are feeding your own mind a fresh dose of the belief that your legitimacy depends on their approval. You are, in that very moment, teaching yourself, again, that you are on trial. This is the part almost nobody sees. The habit of over-explaining isn't a symptom of low self-worth. It is a manufacturing process for low self-worth. Cause and effect run in both directions, and most people only notice the direction that flatters their self-image. I explain myself because I don't feel secure, while missing the other direction entirely. I don't feel secure, in part, because I keep explaining myself. Every unnecessary justification is a small vote cast in an endless election for who gets to decide your value. And if you keep voting for the room instead of for yourself, don't be surprised when the room wins. Consider 2 men, both hypothetical, both plausible, both familiar if you've spent any time watching people move through offices, families, or friendships. The first man makes a decision. He turns down an invitation, he ends a partnership, he chooses silence over an argument he's had 100 times before. Someone asks him why, and he begins. He begins with the immediate reason, then the reason behind the reason, then a preemptive defense against an objection nobody raised yet, then an apology for taking up so much of the conversation with his reasoning, then a promise that it isn't personal, then a final reassurance that he still values the relationship. 90 seconds of speech to defend a decision that took him 3 seconds to make. The second man makes the same decision. Someone asks him why. He says, "It's not the right fit for me right now," and stops, not coldly. There's no edge in it, no performance of toughness, just completion. The sentence is a sentence, not the opening argument of a negotiation. Here is what's actually different between them, underneath the surface. The first man's decision was never fully his. It was provisional, waiting for external ratification. and the flood of explanation was the sound of him trying to secure that ratification after the fact, trying to retroactively make real a decision that in his own mind hadn't fully solidified yet. The second man's decision was complete the moment he made it. The explanation, when it exists at all, is a courtesy extended outward, not a transaction he needs to close to feel safe. This is the first shift, and it changes everything downstream. The amount you explain yourself is not a measure of how much information the situation requires. It is a direct readout of how much your own mind believes the decision without outside confirmation, which means the real work was never about learning to talk less. Talking less is the symptom you're chasing when you should be chasing the disease. The real work is closing the gap between the moment you decide and the moment you believe you've decided, collapsing that gap until it disappears, until your decisions arrive already whole, already needing nothing from anyone else to be real. Now a warning, because this idea is easy to hijack in the wrong direction. There is a cheap, brittle version of not explaining yourself that has nothing to do with power and everything to do with fear wearing a costume. You've seen it. The person who goes silent not because they're secure, but because they're avoidant. Who refuses to explain not out of internal completeness, but because explanation would require confronting something they haven't confronted in themselves. That isn't strength. That's armor. And armor, worn long enough, stops protecting you and starts imprisoning you because you forget how to take it off even in rooms where it was never needed. The distinction matters enormously, so let's be precise about it, because precision here is the difference between building real internal authority and building a hollow performance of it. Silence born of security says, I don't need you to agree with this for it to be true. Silence born of fear says, I can't survive you disagreeing with this, so I won't give you the chance. One is a closed loop of confidence. The other is a closed door hiding an open wound. From the outside, in a single frozen frame, they can look almost identical. Over time, they behave completely differently. Security-based silence can open, when appropriate, into calm, unthreatened explanation. A person secure in a decision can explain it at length warmly without a trace of urgency because explaining doesn't cost them anything. Fear-based silence cannot open at all because any explanation risks exposing the fracture underneath. Watch which one flinches when pressed. That's how you'll always know the difference, in yourself or in anyone else. So the goal was never silence for its own sake. The goal is a particular internal architecture, a self whose decisions are load-bearing on their own, without needing external scaffolding to stay upright. Explanation becomes optional again, the way it was always meant to be. Sometimes you'll offer it generously, because you want to, because it serves the relationship, because clarity is a gift you're choosing to give. Sometimes you won't, because it isn't required and you no longer feel a phantom obligation to supply it. The behavior looks similar from a distance. The internal experience is opposite. Here's where it gets more uncomfortable, because this next layer cuts against almost everything modern culture rewards. We live inside a machine built to extract explanation. Every platform, every algorithm, every performance-based social structure runs on a simple incentive. Justify yourself publicly and you will be rewarded with attention. Stay quiet and you will be rewarded with nothing, or worse, with suspicion. Consider how thoroughly this has trained an entire generation to treat every private decision as a pending public disclosure. The job you didn't take, the relationship you ended, the year you spent doing very little that anyone could see, all of it apparently requiring a caption, a context, a defense against imagined judgment from people who statistically were never thinking about you in the first place. This is not a call to withdraw from the world or to treat other people's opinions as inherently worthless. That would be its own kind of fear in disguise, dressed up as independence. It's a call to notice the machine you're operating inside, because a fish doesn't know it's wet, and you cannot make a deliberate choice about a pressure you've never identified as a pressure. Once you see it, once you notice how much of your explaining is not chosen but conditioned, not offered but extracted, you gain something almost nobody around you has: the ability to opt out selectively, deliberately, instead of complying automatically with a system designed to keep you talking. There's an old and often misunderstood idea about the true enemy of achievement. Not laziness, not stupidity, not bad luck, but a quieter and more corrosive force. The habit of surrendering your own judgment to the anticipated judgment of others before that judgment has even been spoken. Some called this the master fear, the fear beneath all the other named fears. Not the fear of poverty or failure or old age specifically, but the fear of what other people will think, running silently underneath almost every hesitation a person ever feels. An explanation in this light reveals itself as fear's favorite disguise. It looks like communication, it looks like decency, it looks sometimes like humility. But scratch the surface of compulsive, anxious over-explaining, and you will almost always find, underneath, a person negotiating with an imagined judge who was never actually appointed to the bench. Here's the deeper mechanism. Because just stop caring what people think is advice so shallow it has never once worked for anyone who's tried it. You cannot will yourself out of caring. Caring what others think is not a switch. It's a structure, built the same way the original wound was built, through repetition, which means the way out is also through repetition, but repetition pointed in a new direction. Every time you make a decision and resist the pull to justify it beyond what's necessary, you are laying down a new brick in a different foundation. Every time you catch the urge to over-explain and choose a shorter, calmer, more complete sentence instead, you are casting a vote for a different version of yourself, the version whose decisions don't need a courtroom to be valid. Do this once and nothing changes. Do this for months, quietly, consistently, and you begin to notice something remarkable. The urge itself gets quieter, not because you suppressed it, but because you stopped feeding it, and unfed things eventually starve. This is where thought becomes belief, and belief becomes decision, and decision becomes habit, and habit becomes identity, and identity, finally, inevitably, becomes the way you carry yourself in every room you walk into, without effort, without performance, because it is simply who you have become rather than something you are trying to project. Let's make this concrete, because abstraction is where good ideas go to die unused. Picture ordinary situations, the ones that happen every week, not once-in-a-lifetime moments, but the small, everyday tests where this principle either gets applied or gets abandoned. A colleague questions a decision you made in a meeting in front of others with a tone that carries a faint accusation. The old pattern, immediate over-explanation, a rush of context meant to prove you weren't careless, weren't wrong, weren't anything less than fully justified. The new pattern, a brief, factual answer, the actual reason, stated once without an apology tone underneath it, followed by silence. Let the silence sit. Silence in that moment is not empty. It's a signal received by everyone in the room, whether they could name it or not, that you are not available to be cross-examined by someone who wasn't part of the original decision. A family member questions a choice about your own life, where you live, how you spend your time, who you spend it with, using the particular emotional leverage that only family can apply. The old pattern, an exhausting looping defense repeated across every visit, every phone call, as if enough justification might finally, someday, produce approval. The new pattern, a warm but complete answer given once without the compulsion to keep relitigating it every time the subject resurfaces. This is what I've chosen, and I'm at peace with it. Not cold, not combative. Just finished. A stranger online or a critic, or someone with no real stake in your life, offers an opinion about a decision they weren't part of and have no authority over. The old pattern, the itch to respond, to correct the record, to make sure this person who will forget the exchange within the hour, understands that you were right. The new pattern, nothing. Not out of superiority, but out of recognition that some rooms were never yours to occupy in the first place, and stepping into every one of them, every time, is how you end up a stranger to your own peace. Notice the thread running through all three. The shift isn't about becoming harsher or colder or less generous with your reasoning. It's about restoring a boundary that should have existed the whole time, a boundary between the people who have earned a real accounting of your choices and the people who have merely demanded one. Not everyone who asks why deserves an answer. Proximity is not the same as entitlement. A person can be standing right in front of you and still have no actual claim on your interior life. This naturally raises the question almost everyone eventually asks when they first start taking this seriously. Doesn't this risk making me arrogant? Doesn't withholding explanation risk cutting people off, isolating me, turning me into someone cold and unreachable? It's a fair question, and the honest answer requires a distinction most people never make. There is a difference between explaining and connecting, and collapsing the two together is exactly what keeps people trapped in compulsive justification. Connection is intimacy, sharing your inner world with people you trust, freely because you want to be known by them. Explanation, in the compulsive sense we've been describing, is defense. Offering an account of yourself to people, known or unknown, because you fear the consequences of not offering it. One deepens relationships. The other, ironically, often damages the very relationships it's trying to protect, because chronic over-explaining broadcasts a subtle but unmistakable signal. I am not sure I have the right to this decision. And people, consciously or not, treat that signal as an invitation to keep probing, keep questioning, keep pushing, not necessarily out of cruelty, but because uncertainty projected outward invites exactly the scrutiny it's trying to avoid. Strip the anxious defense away, and connection doesn't disappear. It gets stronger. because what remains is explanation freely given rather than explanation extracted under pressure, and freely given information always lands differently than extracted information, the way a gift lands differently than a ransom payment. There's a subtler layer here worth sitting with, because it goes to the heart of what actually produces the outward calm we started with, the person in the room who doesn't reach for a defense. That calm is not a performance technique. It cannot be faked convincingly for long, because the body and the voice leak what the mind actually believes, no matter how well rehearsed the words are. Which means the entire project comes down to one question, asked honestly, over and over, in the quiet moments before and after every decision you make. Do I actually believe this, or am I hoping other people's approval will finish the job of believing it for me? This is where a decision, not the specific decision, but the very act of deciding as a discipline becomes central. Indecisive people, whether or not they realize it, are the most compulsive explainers of all, because an unfinished decision is exactly the kind of thing that keeps searching for outside validation to complete it. If you have never fully decided in your own mind that a choice is yours to make and yours alone to answer for, you will spend the rest of your life outsourcing the final 10% of every decision to whoever happens to be in the room asking questions. The habit of over-explaining, traced all the way back, is very often just the visible symptom of decisions that were never actually finished, closed on the outside in words and actions, but still quietly open on the inside, still waiting for a verdict. Closing that gap is not about arrogance. It's not about deciding faster or more recklessly. It's about deciding completely, turning a choice over fully in your own mind before you speak it into the world, so that by the time anyone else hears about it, there is nothing left unresolved inside you for their reaction to disturb. And this connects to something rarely discussed in the language of ordinary motivation. The mind, left undisciplined, does not wait passively for facts before forming conviction. It manufactures conviction constantly out of whatever is repeated to it most often, true or not, which means every unnecessary explanation you give is doing double duty. Outwardly, it's a sentence spoken to another person. Inwardly, it's a repetition fed back to your own mind, and your own mind does not distinguish neatly between explaining to convince someone else and explaining to convince yourself. Every time you justify a decision you didn't need to justify, some part of you registers the act as evidence that justification was required. And a mind that keeps receiving that evidence will inevitably start to believe it. Flip this and you find the lever. If repeated explanation manufactures doubt, then repeated completion manufactures conviction. Every time you state a decision plainly and let it stand without defense, you are not just behaving differently. You are feeding your own mind a different diet, and minds, like bodies, become what they're fed. Do this enough times in small, ordinary moments that nobody else will ever notice, and something shifts that no one taught you to expect. The compulsion to explain doesn't get suppressed through willpower. It gets replaced through repetition, the same mechanism that built it in the first place, now running in the opposite direction. There is an old idea about the mind functioning less like a passive receiver and more like a transmitting station, broadcasting constantly whatever it has been trained to broadcast, whether or not you're consciously aware of the signal. People pick up more from your posture, your pacing, your tone, and your certainty than from your words, and this is precisely why two people can say the exact same sentence, "I've decided not to do that," and produce completely different responses in the room. One version broadcasts a request for permission disguised as a statement. The other broadcasts a fact. Rooms respond to facts differently than they respond to requests for permission, even when the audience couldn't tell you why. This is the real, practical shift this entire idea is pointing toward. Not a script to memorize, not a set of clever one-liners to deploy the next time someone questions you, but a genuine internal recalibration of where your decisions get their authority from. For most of your life, that authority came from outside, from approval granted or withheld by parents, teachers, employers, partners, strangers, algorithms. The work now is relocating that authority inward, decision by decision, sentence by sentence, until the outside world's approval becomes something you're glad to have rather than something you require to feel whole. None of this happens through a single insight, however clear. It happens through practice, deliberate, unglamorous, repeated practice, the same way any real skill is built. So here is what that practice actually looks like, stripped of mysticism, made ordinary enough to use today. Before you speak a justification, pause, even half a second, and ask one honest question. Is this person owed an explanation, or am I about to give one out of habit? Not every why deserves a paragraph. Some deserve one clean sentence. Some deserve nothing at all. When you do explain, practice stopping at the first complete sentence instead of the fifth. Say the true reason once. Resist the urge to keep building a case after the verdict has already been delivered, a habit almost everyone carries from childhood, from all those years spent trying to out-argue a no into eventually becoming a yes. That world is over. You are not appealing a verdict anymore. You are stating one, nada, specifically the physical sensation that arrives right before you over-explain, a tightness, a rush, a felt need to fill the silence. That sensation is data. It's the fear responding in real time to a perceived threat that in almost every case isn't actually there. Learning to feel that sensation without obeying it is itself the entire discipline. Distilled into one repeatable moment, you'll get dozens of chances to practice every single week. And when you succeed, when you state something plainly and let it stand, and the world doesn't end, and the room doesn't collapse, and the relationship doesn't dissolve, take a moment consciously to register that success. Most people let these small victories pass unnoticed, and unnoticed victories don't compound. Noticed ones do. This is how new belief gets built, not through one dramatic transformation, but through the accumulated weight of 100 small moments where you prove to yourself quietly that your decisions could stand without a defense. Over time, and this part cannot be rushed, no matter how badly you might want to skip ahead to the finished version of yourself, something in the underlying identity begins to shift. You stop asking, in the back of your mind, what should I do to make this acceptable to them? And you start asking a different, much heavier question. Who do I have to become for this decision to already be enough on its own without anyone's ratification? That question is uncomfortable because it removes the escape hatch of blaming other people's judgment for your own hesitation. But it's also the only question that actually leads anywhere because it points the work back to the only place where real change has ever been possible. Inside you, not inside the opinions of a room you don't control. This is, in the end, what separates people who move through the world with quiet, unforced authority from people who move through it, constantly performing a defense they were never actually required to give. It isn't charisma. It isn't confidence as a personality trait some people are lucky enough to be born with. It's a private internal transaction, repeated so many times it stops feeling like a transaction at all. The transaction of deciding something fully, believing it without outside confirmation, and letting the decision itself, standing alone, be the entire statement. So return for a moment to that room from the very beginning, the one where a question lands like a challenge, and everyone watches to see who reaches for a defense. You already know now what separates the two kinds of people standing in it. It was never about what they said. It was about what they had already settled long before the question was ever asked. The explanation, when it doesn't come, isn't withheld out of coldness. It simply isn't needed because the decision was never waiting on anyone else to become real. That is the room you're building toward, one unexplained decision at a time, not a room where you owe nothing to anyone. A room where what you offer freely, and what you don't, you no longer feel you have to. Keep thinking, keep deciding, keep becoming the kind of mind whose conclusions don't need a courtroom.